in this series on Jonah, but before we talk about Jonah, I need to take you back in time a little bit in my life and talk about January of 2021. It was the worst of times and the best of times. January 2021, I had to go to the eye doctor. And if there are eye doctors in the room, I don't want to offend you, but we don't want to see you. Not personally, barbecues, fine. Well, all that's fine. We just don't want to come to your office. And here's why. Because you do terribly uncomfortable things to our eyes. We don't like that. We don't like the puff of air. No matter how much you explain it to us, we don't like it. We don't like all the drops. We don't like the prodding, like stare at the barn, clearer here, fuzzier there. And I know it's good for us. I know why I went, because I couldn't see anything and needed new glasses, but we don't want to see you. And so I ended up going and had all the tests, the puff of air, look at the barn, better here, clearer there. I had all that stuff done. And then when I was finished with that, the eye doctor said, hey, I'd like to do one more thing. I'd like to take an ultrasound picture of your eye. And I said, well, there's been 12 terribly uncomfortable things already. What's one more? And so she took an ultrasound picture of my eye, and I brought it to show you. So this is my retina. I feel so much closer to you guys now. This is the side of me people don't see. So we sat down with this picture, and she looked at me and she said, do you see the white things at the top? I said, I do. What is that? And she said, those are tears in your retina. And I said, that sounds bad. She goes, that's kind of bad. I said, so what does that mean? And she said, well, if they're left unattended, they can fill with fluid, and your retina could detach from your eye. I said, that sounds terrible. She goes, that is terrible. I said, I don't want that. She said, I don't want that for you. And so I said, so what do we do? And she said, well, you're going to have to go to a retina specialist. I said, when can that happen? She said, not anytime soon. There's a long waiting list. And so I did what you probably did. I waited incredibly patiently and didn't freak out, didn't imagine worst case scenarios, didn't think that my eyeball was exploding every minute of every day. I didn't do that. Of course I did that. That's what we all would do. I panicked the whole time I was waiting. But you need to know that 25 minutes before I saw this picture, my life was fine. Like everything was good. We were clipping along. It was freezing in Chicago, but everything was fine. But now I had heard this, and I couldn't go back to the time before I saw this picture or heard those words. But I also had no idea what I was going to do next. So I was just stuck in the present tense. And maybe you've had that experience. You said what you were thinking before you thought about what you were saying. Some people do that. You posted on the Facebook thread and you said it and you looked at it and you're like, I probably shouldn't have done that, but now this chaos has ensued. Maybe the job you started on a Monday, you leave for the last time on a Friday. The relationship you thought was going to be the one, or the date you thought was finally going to be the one, ends with another quiet goodbye. Maybe the family that used to be so close is now splintered. Maybe you went to the doctor and got a diagnosis, and now everything has changed. Maybe you just have this feeling like something needs to change. I cannot stay here. I cannot go back to the time before I was where I'm at right now, but I have no idea what it means to move forward. What do we do? What do you and I do with these in-between times? When we can't go forward and we can't go back. What do we do when all we have is the view from the belly? We're in this series on the book of Jonah. And if you were not here or you didn't see Corey's teaching from last week, please go watch that. It was a wonderful setup to the book. But ultimately, Jonah is a person who got a book named after him, which is amazing. Jonah is asked by God to be a prophet. And prophets' jobs were to go and tell people, hey, the path you're on, pretty destructive. If you keep following it, this is where it's going to end. But if you stop following it, God will give you life. They weren't there just to hammer on people. They were there to turn them from destruction and turn them back to life. The problem is God said, Jonah, I want you to go to the Assyrians, to Nineveh, to the people who are enemies of, well, everybody, because they just killed everybody in front of them. And God says, I want you to go and tell these people that the path they're on is destructive and let them turn so that I might give them life. What happens when God falls in love with your enemies? What happens when God wants to give life to the people you want to have life least? Well, Jonah can't handle it. And so instead of going to them, he goes 5 times the distance in the opposite direction. Instead of going to Nineveh, he jumps on a boat and heads to a place called Tarshish. And so he's in the middle of the ocean, and a storm comes up. And all the sailors on board, they don't believe in one particular God. And so they're like, what could this have? Somebody made God mad. The God's mad. What do we do about this? Where's this coming from? And I have to imagine Jonah's kind of sitting in the back going, I think I might know what this is about. This might be about me. And so he says, I don't want to endanger your lives, so throw me overboard. Now, there is no Coast Guard at the time. There are no life preservers. So when he says, throw me over, he says, this is the end of the road for me. And so they throw him overboard. Now, at that point, Jonah's story probably should have ended. But here's what happens instead. Jonah gets thrown overboard, and it says, now the Lord provided a huge fish to swallow Jonah. And Jonah was in the belly of the fish 3 days and 3 nights. Jonah thought he was going to die, and instead, God provides this big fish. And Jonah goes into this thing for 3 days and 3 nights. He spends that time in a place that is kind of an in-between. Like, he can't go back to the boat, and he clearly can't go forward. He doesn't know what's going to happen next, so he's sort of stuck in that in-between moment, in the belly of the fish. There's another word for this experience or the feeling of what it's like to be there, and it's just the word restlessness. This feeling like I can't stay here, I can't go back, but I can't go forward. Something needs to change. I can't stay in the belly forever. I had a chance to write a book about this, and it might be helpful to you. It may not be, whatever. It's called The Gift of Restlessness. But ultimately, when I think about restless times like this is how I would define it. Restlessness is about the unsettled, irritated seasons where we are stuck in the present tense. I can't go back to the time before the ultrasound. I cannot go forward to meet the retina specialist. I'm stuck right here. I can't go back to before saying what I said, and I have no idea how that's all going to turn out. I can't go back before I got the diagnosis, lost the job, lost the person, lost the relationship, but I have no idea what's going to happen next. That's restlessness. That's the place where Jonah found himself. And what I think is wonderful about these times, as terrible, because you're hearing that definition, you're like, well, I don't want to be there. None of us want to be there. We end up there because we're alive and taking breath and living with people. None of us want to be there, but the beautiful thing about those times is that that's where God makes a space for us. And if there's anywhere we can jump into the story of Jonah, it's right there. In the middle of that restlessness, it says that God provided a huge fish. This is not ideal. Drowning is not great, but being in the belly of a huge fish isn't ideal either. Can you imagine how it felt to Jonah? He's thrown overboard. He's like, okay, here's where it ends. And all of a sudden, and then he's just standing there going, whoa. Okay, so I'm not dead, I don't think, but I'm here. And I don't want to be here, but here's better than dead. So these places in between, these restless spots, they're not ideal. None of us want to be there. But they can be very good. They're places that God provides for us, right there, where we can change, where we can grow, where we can get stronger. And there are all kinds of places throughout the story of the Bible where this happens to people. Heroes, people you would know by name. They're either called restless places or I call them belly places. Sometimes they're called wilderness. They're places where they're out in the middle of nowhere and they encounter God. There's a man named Abraham. He goes into the wilderness and he meets a God that he's never met for the first time. There's a guy named Moses who goes into the wilderness, gets into a fight, gets married, and then God tells him who he really is. There's a prophet named Elijah who is exhausted from doing exactly what he had been asked to do. And he goes into the wilderness and God says, you need to eat something and take a nap. And when you wake up, eat something again and then take another nap. And then when you wake up from that one, eat something and then take another nap. This is my favorite passage. Eat, nap, eat, nap, eat, nap, and God is there. Isn't that amazing? And then there's Jesus. Jesus goes into the wilderness and is tempted with stuff that we're tempted with. The temptation to be relevant, to be powerful, to be spectacular, to prove our worth to the world. And Jesus gets all these temptations thrown at him, and he simply says, you're missing the point. None of that's the point. The wilderness is the place where when we get stuck, God meets us. Those in-between places, those belly places, those restless places. They can be a gift. And here's what I would say about that. Restless places can be a gift because they are where we become the people God has made us to be. When we are in the belly, we are being shaped and formed into the people we were always meant to be. And deep down, we're being shaped and formed into the people we've always wanted to be. That deep desire to handle life in a different way. So that when we are standing in line at the grocery store staring at the 35 varieties of peppermints, and we feel like our feet have been drilled into the linoleum underneath us, and we're saying, I cannot stay here any longer. I am in the belly. That when we're there, God is doing something. God is active. God is working. Because when Jonah finds himself in this moment, here's what he does. From inside of the fish, Jonah prayed to the Lord his God. From inside the fish, when he gets stuck in that belly place, Jonah does what most of us would do. We cry out. Help me, save me, rescue me. He cries out from inside the fish. Now the word inside there is really interesting because it can mean guts, it can mean insides, but it can also mean a womb. And this is where this is so powerful, because a womb is a place where new life comes from. So as Jonah is in the womb, there's this new life that's coming. There's something new that's happening. Jonah is being changed and shaped and transformed. Or, in the way Bible scholar R.T. Kendall says it, he says, the belly of the fish is not a happy place to live. None of us want to be there. But it is a good place to learn. It is a good place to become who we were meant to be, who God had always wanted us to be. February 2021. Finally got to see a retina specialist. Took almost a month. And if you don't like the eye doctor, do not go to a retina specialist. No less than 13 people poked me in the eyeball. Some of them I don't even think worked there. I think they were just volunteers who were in the area, like, you want to poke a guy in the eye? Here you go, let's do this. I had like 12 eye drops. There were the tests and the pictures and the air. We did the air puff thing again. I was like, again, I already did this like a month ago. We did all of those things again, and so I'm blurry. I can't really make out anything. I'm sitting in an exam room, and this shape in scrubs comes in and walks towards me. I'm like, well, it must be the specialist. I don't know who it is, but I'm trusting that that's a person in authority. And he came up to me, and he said, yeah, okay, so I looked at all the pictures, and yeah, you have holes in both eyes. I said, I just had one a month ago. I am clearly an overachiever. Love it. I said, all right, so what do we do now? I can't stay here. What do we do now? And he said, well, we take a laser. Now, as a kid who grew up on Star Wars, I was like, yes. And he said, we fire it into your eye. And I was like, no. No. And he said, we burn those little tears so that they seal and so no fluid leaks in there and so it won't detach. He said, it's very painful. It's a longer recovery, but it'll fix this for now. And so I wasn't expecting this, so I looked at him and I said, do you think I should do it? And he says, well, you could go home and think about it. He pauses for probably a tenth of a second. He says, but there was this one time, and he goes into this story for probably 2 minutes of a person who went home and thought about it. Their retina detached. They had 3 surgeries. They had to lay on their face for like 3 months just to recover. And I looked at him, and in my head, I was like, you are going to let me go home and think about this. You're a terrible doctor. When we're in the belly and we can't go back and we can't go forward, we're usually faced with some painful choices. I don't want that. But I have no idea how to move forward, and this seems like the way. And so I said, all right, doc, there's really no other choice. I'm already here and I'm already all gooped up. So they gooped me up some more. They put this machine and they started firing this laser in my eye. And he said, now, if this hurts too much, tell me to stop. I'm like, I can't do that. We'll never be done. So he continued and he finished, and I leaned back and I was like, well, at least that one step is taken care of. And so I felt like I had made a move. Now, there was a painful consequence that was coming that I had no idea about. But in the moment, I felt like at least we took a step here. Every time we're in the belly, every time we're in that dark place, we want to take a step. We want to keep moving. We want to try and fix it. And yet that's not always an option. So Jonah cries out because all he's got around him is the view of fish insides, and he has no idea what's going to happen next. And so he cries out to God and he prays. Now, this time that he's in the belly, they say 3 days and 3 nights. That is an image that they a lot of times used in storytelling around Jonah's time to talk about the journey from death to life. So everybody listening to the story would have known Jonah spent this time in the belly, 3 days, 3 nights. This is a story about someone dying and coming back to life. And we'll come back to that in a minute. But while he was there, in chapter 2, it tells us that Jonah launches into this prayer. And he cries out to the Lord, and this is what he says. In my distress, I called to the Lord, and he answered me. From deep in the realm of the dead, I called for help, and you listened to my cry. You hurled me into the depths, into the very heart of the seas, and the currents swirled about me, and all your waves and your breakers swept over me. The engulfing waters threatened me. The deep surrounded me. Seaweed was wrapped around my head, possibly historical evidence of the first spa treatment. I didn't know if you knew this. That's probably what, no, it's not. But when my life was ebbing away, I remembered you, Lord, and my prayer rose to you, to your holy temple. In the middle of the belly, Jonah cries out because he's got nothing else. And that's typically where we are. When we cannot go back and we cannot go forward, all we really have is the ability to cry out. Now, the interesting thing about this prayer is we don't know when he did it. So imagine if this is day 1 in the belly. He's got 2 more days to go. He cries out to God and says, in my distress, I called to you and you answered me. You listened to me. I remembered you. And I've got 2 more days to sit with that, with my disconnection, with this darkness, with this feeling like I wish I could go back, but I can't, but I have no idea what it looks like to go forward. When we have the view from the belly, we cannot help but grow if we're willing to step into it, because we have to hold 2 things in tension. This stinks, and God is with me. Not good, not alone. My life is ebbing away, and God is remembering me. When we hold those 2 things at the same time, it's the only way we go through. Because there are 2 different kinds of messages I could give you about this. One is, everything's going to be fine, yay! But you know that's not true, and I know that's not true. The other message could be, everything's going to be terrible forever and ever, boo, and none of us want that. And Jonah is telling a very different story. Jonah is saying, but in this in-between place, both tension and darkness and life are meeting if I can just hold on to this. It's sort of like the spot between pregnancy and birth. It's that labor place. Down in the womb, something new is coming to life, but there's this pain that comes in the process. And that comes from holding on to 2 things, one that we don't want to be true and one that we desperately want to be true. So in the restless spaces where we feel like we're dying, our life is just draining out of us, we cry out to God and he hears us in our distress. Our life is ebbing away and we remember that God is with us. From the deep realm of the dead, God listens to us. And our option there is to cry out, but there's one option we often take instead, and that option is to try and fix it ourselves. We're like, well, I'm just going to take care of this. Nobody else is. God's not doing anything. I'm stuck in the belly, so I'm just going to fix this. So I'm just going to try harder. I'm just going to work harder, or I'm going to just minimize it and say, well, it's not as bad as my neighbor, or it's not as bad as this other person. Or we say, I think I'll just cut a corner in my character. I'll just do something that's out of line with who I really am and try and get myself out of this situation. I'll just power through. Jonah actually talks about that in his prayer. He says this. He says, those who cling to worthless idols turn away from God's love for them. It's important to understand that he's not saying they lose God's love for them. What he's saying is they turn away from the fact that God is loving them even in the belly, and instead turn to worthless idols, one of which is our own ability to fix stuff, to take care of it ourselves. Here's one way to think about what idols are. Idols are what we turn to instead when our love for God is contingent on God making things happen for us and on our timeline. Jonah has no idea how long he is going to be in the belly. If he prays that prayer on day one, he's got 2 more days to sit in the midst of it. God is not working on Jonah's timeline. And so Jonah holds on to this stinks and God is with me, and he holds on for dear life. Instead of turning to his own abilities, his own power, his own strength, his own intelligence, his own capacity, he just holds on to those 2 things and says, I am in the belly and I'm holding on to this with everything that I have. And eventually what happens in those dark spaces for you and I, when we can't go back and can't go forward, is that the curtain gets pulled back on the wizard. And we see that we're not as strong as we thought we were. And we learn that we far too often depend on our own skills and abilities rather than depending on the God who can save us from the belly. And even if we feel abandoned there, even if while we're holding on to this stinks and God is with me, even if we feel abandoned, there is this language in the Bible that reaches out to us from Psalm 34 that says, the Lord is close to the brokenhearted and saves those who are crushed in spirit. If Jonah is not brokenhearted and crushed in spirit, I have no idea what those 2 things mean. When we said what we were thinking, so thinking about what we were saying, when we received the diagnosis, when we've lost the job, we've lost the relationship, we've lost the family, sometimes when we've lost our faith. When addiction seems to hold on a lot longer than we want it to, when that happens, when we are brokenhearted and crushed in spirit, that is when God is closest to us. If you're not sure if you even believe in this God, can I be honest with you? This is not contingent on your belief. God is near you whether you believe it or not. The question is, will you let that change you? Through Jesus, will you let that enter into your life and change you, even when you're in the midst of the belly, even in the midst of the darkness? So I'm sitting in the exam room, all fuzzy and blurry, and one of the techs comes in and she slides a piece of paper in front of me and she says, here's some things for you to read. Because at that moment when you can't see anything, the one thing you want is some reading material. And I said, I can't see that. Could you read it to me? She said, absolutely, I can do that for you. It's just about your recovery. I said, okay, that'd be great. She says, okay, you can't lift anything over 10 pounds. Okay. Do you know how many things in your life weigh 10 pounds or more? Like a decent basket of laundry, 10 pounds probably. We had a West Highland Terrier named Winston. He weighed 15 pounds at the time. I couldn't even duffel him around the house pretend he was flying. I couldn't do that. The garbage, I don't know if this happens in your house, happens at our house. You know when you walk up to it and you see there's some space in the top and you put your stuff in and then you push it down? Because what you're assuming is that the next person will take it out, except for the next person has the same perspective that you do because there's room now because you pushed it down. So they put their stuff in, they push it down, and eventually the thing weighs roughly about as much as a Hyundai. And it takes 2 people and you have to put the can between your knees and, okay, it's just me then? Great. Way more than 10 pounds. And I couldn't do anything vigorous, and I couldn't do any exercise, and I couldn't do any of those things, 10 pounds or exercise or anything vigorous, for a month. That's a long time. And because God has a sense of humor, the next day after my procedure, it snowed 15 inches in Chicago. And there was a person in our house who had been delegated early on, in the fall, mind you, to set up the snowblower in advance of this time when we may need it. And it was me, and who didn't. So I didn't have the snowblower set up. My wife then had to go outside, and I watched her on that first day shovel our driveway 5 times, just so we could get the cars out. I watched her stand in thigh-deep snow with a rake scraping snow off of our roof, because where we live, that's a thing you have to do. So praise the Lord, you live where you do. We have to clear out so the roof doesn't cave in. And all I could do was sit there. There was nothing in me that said, I'm just going to go out, forget Western medicine. What do those blurry people know? I'm just going to start chucking, 15-pound things of snow. We're going to get this done. I couldn't do that. I began to learn something about my frailty, about the fact that I wasn't as strong as I thought I was, how much value I put into what I could accomplish. My own power, my own ability. Folks, I was in the belly. And I couldn't go back to the time before the Jedi laser was fired in my eye, and I couldn't go forward either. I just had to stay there. And God began to teach me something. Taught me to value my wife a whole lot more. Taught me to set up the dang snowblower. So I'd do it in August, Taught me a bunch of things. But it's in the belly that we learn those things. And then something happens, eventually. And this is how Jonah's story begins. This part of it begins to end. And it ends, well, the way that it ends. And here's what it says. And the Lord commanded the fish, and it vomited Jonah onto dry land. Have you ever been vomited? Just curious. Actually, I love this. The Hebrew word for vomited, I'm not saying that because I want to be super nerdy, but I think this is important. The Hebrew word for vomited is the word yacheh. It sounds like vomiting. So Jonah goes through this dark belly experience, holding in tension, this stinks and God is with me. And when it ends, the fish yakees him up onto the, he doesn't come out of the deep with on a golden seahorse with Disney music swelling behind him with the Gaston pose. That's not what he does. He gets puked up onto the shore, covered in fish stuff with scars and smells and stories that he will probably never tell anybody. But he's out, and he's alive, but he's different. When we cannot go back, and we can't go forward, and we're stuck in the belly, eventually this will come to an end, and we will be yached out the other side, but we will be different. God changes us through that process. My eye was fixed, sure, but there were some things that changed about me. Some things that made me different. There was a time when some religious people came to Jesus and they said to him, we want you to prove that you're who you say you are. And that's kind of the challenge a lot of us have in our life. People around us say, prove to us that you are who you say you are. Prove that you are capable, competent, intelligent. Prove to us that you matter, that you're valuable. Show us your vacation pictures and put a filter on them so we can see that you really enjoyed yourself. And they come to Jesus and they say, prove yourself to us. Show us who you really say you are. And Jesus tells them this. He says, a wicked and adulterous generation wants a sign, but none will be given it except what? The sign of the prophet Jonah. Jesus says, you guys want me to prove who I really am, show you something miraculous, show you something spectacular? Nah, what you're going to get is 3 days in the darkness. And then on the other end, I will be yached back out into the world, and new life will come for everyone who wants to follow me. Jonah came out with scars, wounds, stories. Jesus came out with scars, wounds, stories of new life. We come out of the belly with scars related to shame and failure and addiction, but we come out the other side and we have a new story to tell. We have the most compelling story that anyone has ever heard. And that story is that because of Jesus, death does not get to win. The belly doesn't get to win. The darkness doesn't get to win. Instead, it shapes us and changes us as we say, this stinks, but God is with me. And when we get yached out the other end, we tell a new story that a world around us is desperate to hear. We would love to skip the fish. We would love to skip the diagnosis. We'd love to skip all of those things. I totally get it, but we can't, because without it, we would never have what comes on the other side. If Jesus had skipped the 3 days in the darkness, we would never have this story of new life that we have here and now. So how does this look practically? I think there are 3 things that we see when we go through this process, when we go through the belly and come out the other side. Here's the first. These restless times mean that something is going to die. Something is going to go away and never be the same again. And we will mourn it and we will grieve it, whether that's a relationship or a status in life or a physical power or ability. Something's going away. But here's what Jesus says about those things dying. He says, very truly, I tell you, unless a kernel of wheat falls to the ground and dies, it remains only a single seed. But if it dies, if it goes through the belly, it produces many seeds, many pieces of new life. We go from having just one thing to give to having multiple stories to give. I went from just having a story of an eye procedure to now I get to tell all of you that, and you get to step in wherever you fit. And you get to learn what restlessness looks like for you. Jonah, he gets to learn that he cannot be angry at the Assyrians anymore forever. And he kind of does that, but I'll let someone else tell you that part. Second thing we know is that restless times mean that something new is coming to life. There's always something new on the other side. On the other side of the darkness, on the other side of the in-between, the restless times, the belly, there's always new life coming. There's always something rising within us that is more beautiful and powerful and new. Jesus says we are being transformed. All of us are being transformed into Jesus' image. Paul says this, not Jesus. Are being transformed into his image with ever-increasing glory, which comes from the Lord, who is the Spirit. We are becoming something. The darkness is forming us, and we're coming out the other side with a brand new life and brand new stories to tell from our wounds that have become scars. And finally, the restless times mean that eventually things will never be the same. Jonah is going to be different. You don't get puked up by a big fish and stay the same. You don't die and come back from the grave and the world stays the same. Jesus does that, and all of us have a chance for our lives to be totally renovated and shifted and changed, the way we see everything. From who we value to what we value to who we are to what we love, everything changes if Jesus comes out the other side. I got to see this phenomenon a couple weeks ago when I was sitting in a theater, and I looked down the rows near me, and I watched grown men with mortgages and jobs, families to be responsible for. I watched them weep like children while watching Guardians of the Galaxy and thinking about this guy. I watched them cry like children, and I cried like a child myself over a CGI raccoon with Bradley Whitford's voice, whatever, you just do your thing. I'm not going to spoil this, but here's what I'm going to say. This story resonated with people. You connected with this story. If you haven't seen the movie yet, please go see it. They're not paying me to say that, but please go see it. This is a tremendous story. Anyway, why are grown men with mortgages and children and jobs crying over a cartoon or a computer-imaged raccoon? Because there's something about it that connected with them. There's something about the Jonah story. There's something perhaps about my stupid eye story. There's something about these stories. There's something about the story of Jesus dying and rising that connects with us. And the reason why is all of us know what it feels like to go into the belly. What we don't know is, can we come out the other side? And the gospel says there is always the other side. There is always forgiveness. There is always grace because of Jesus. Because he went first, we might follow him through. And so I'm not here to convince you about Rocket. I'm not here to convince you to go see your eye doctor. Probably not a bad decision, but go ahead and do that. I'm here to say that there is life on the other side of the belly that you're in. There really is. Because that's Jesus' desire. He went through death so that we might have life if we would only follow him. Or the way Jesus himself puts it, I have come that you might have life and life to the full. If you're in this belly space today, I want to offer you something practical you can do. It's a really short one-sentence prayer that I would invite you to pray as you go through this time of this stinks, but I think God is here. And this very simple prayer goes like this: God, I'm in the belly, meet me here. Even if you're not sure that there is a God, even if you don't believe, if you believe, yeah, try this. Just experiment with this. God, I'm in the belly, meet me here. You may want to make this the lock screen on your phone. You might want to write it down in some place that's prominent. You might want to get it tattooed on your arm. That seems extreme, but if you want to do that, that's up to you. But I assure you that God is in the belly with you and that there is life on the other side.
Hey everyone, thank you so much for joining us on our YouTube channel today. I hope that you felt the welcome home of Christ right through your screen. Here we believe that the gospel is good news worth sharing. So if you'd like to share this stream with your friends and family, you can also subscribe to this channel, and you can use @BridgeChurchTN. Also, if you'd like to give, there's a link in the description there you can click, and it'll walk you through all the steps. And if you'd like to stay connected with us, you can simply head on over to bridge.tv. Hope to see you again soon.